All right, let's just jump right in today with a question that's, well, it's pretty uncomfortable. We're going to talk about a link between one of the darkest figures in all of history and one of the world's great moments of liberation. The question is, did Hitler actually help India gain its independence? Let's dig in.
Yeah, I know, it sounds absolutely shocking, and frankly, it is. But the question is a real one that historians have debated. Is there a genuine, tangible connection between Adolf Hitler and India's fight for freedom? We're going to unpack both sides of this.
So, to really get to the bottom of this, we have to set the scene. We've got to go back in time because understanding the world as it was back then, that's totally crucial to piecing this whole puzzle together.
Okay, so our story really happens at the intersection of two huge historical timelines. First, you've got this period from 1919 to 1947. This is when Indian nationalism is just exploding, really hitting its peak. And at the same time, you have World War II, raging from 39 to 45. And it's right there, in that overlap, that's where things get really interesting.
You really can't overstate how important India was to the British Empire. I mean, Britain was completely dependent on India for everything. Food, textiles, a ton of tax revenue, and cheap, often free labor. This economic engine, it was the absolute bedrock of British global power.
But you know, that kind of dependency, it also creates a massive vulnerability for Britain. And that vulnerability leads us to a classic, age-old strategic idea, and to a really important figure in India's freedom struggle.
You've heard this one before. It's an ancient idea, but during World War II, it became a very powerful, very real strategy. Think about it. Britain and Germany are in this fight to the death. So for some Indian nationalist leaders, seeing Britain's biggest enemy in action, well, that looked like a golden opportunity.
And that brings us to the man himself, Subhash Chandra Bose. Now, Bose was different. He saw what other leaders were doing, but he was absolutely convinced that political protests alone weren't going to cut it. He believed India needed a real military strategy to win its freedom.
And Bose, he had a very clear three-step plan. Step 1, team up with Germany. Step 2, let World War II do the heavy lifting of weakening Britain from the outside, draining their money, their troops. And step 3, use all that external pressure to fuel the fire of the freedom movement that was already burning bright inside India. He thought this combination, this 1-2 punch, would be enough to make a crippled Britain finally give up.
So that was the plan. How did it actually go down once the world went to war? Well, Bose put his plan into action. He was instrumental in forming the Azad Hind Fauj, which you might know as the Free Indian Legion. This was a real military unit, an army, with one single mission: fight for India's freedom.
So who was in this army? Well, it was a mix. You had Indian students who were living in Germany at the time. And this is the really wild part, it also included Indian prisoners of war, soldiers who'd been captured while fighting for the British. Now they were being asked to flip sides and fight against them. Pretty incredible. But, and this is a big but, there was a huge problem. This Grand Alliance, it wasn't really what Bose had envisioned. Our sources are really clear on this. When Bose actually met Hitler, the response he got was, and I'm quoting here, disappointing. Hitler was wishy-washy, he offered very limited help. So that powerful anti-British alliance Bose was counting on, it never really happened.
And yet, look what happened. The war ends in 45, and just 2 years later, in 1947, the British are gone. India is independent. So what gives? If the alliance was a bust, what actually happened?
Well, one major argument is that the war itself did the job, just indirectly. Think about it. 6 years of all-out war absolutely wrecked the British economy. It drained their military. So yeah, Britain was on the winning side, but they were also broke. They just didn't have the cash or the soldiers anymore to keep a grip on their massive empire.
But this is where the debate really heats up. Was the war the knockout blow? Was that external pressure the thing that finally broke the camel's back? Or was the real game-changing power coming from inside India all along?
Okay, so let's shift gears and look at that other side of the argument, which is just incredibly powerful.
Because look, if you think the war was the only reason for India's independence, you're missing out on decades of history. We have to remember that the fight for freedom in India wasn't some new thing. It was a long, powerful, organized movement that had been building and building for years, long before World War II even started.
And you can see it right here.
We're talking about massive protests against things like the Rowlatt Act, the nationwide outrage after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, huge movements like non-cooperation and civil disobedience. I mean, these weren't just little blips on the radar. These were enormous nationwide movements that were already making it almost impossible for the British to govern.
So here's the bottom line. By the time World War II kicked off in 1939, that fire of Indian nationalism, it was already a raging inferno. The sources we're looking at describe it as a fearsome and unified force that the British could barely handle. The pressure from within was already at its absolute breaking point.
Okay, so now we've got these two huge forces pushing for the same thing, the external shock of a world war and the internal momentum of a freedom struggle that's been going on for decades. So, how do these two pieces fit together?
And I think this really sums it up perfectly. You can think of World War II as the catalyst. It's the thing that sped everything up. It weakened Britain, it created the opportunity. But the fundamental cause, that was India's own freedom struggle. It was all those decades of sacrifice, all that activism, that built a nation that was ready and unified enough to grab that opportunity when it appeared.
And really, that's the key takeaway here. The war basically opened a window of opportunity. It created a moment of weakness for the British Empire. But, and this is so important, without a unified, determined Indian population ready to act, a population that had been forged in decades of struggle, that window could have just slammed shut again.
So that brings us all the way back to where we started. Did Hitler help India gain independence? Well, you could argue that indirectly, yes, by starting a war that crippled Britain. But what the evidence really seems to show is that the real credit, the true driving force, belongs to the millions of Indians who had already built a movement so powerful that when that moment of opportunity arrived, independence wasn't just a possibility, it was inevitable. And it leaves you with a big question, right? What really makes history? Is it the unexpected opportunity that falls from the sky, or is it the decades of hard work that make you ready to catch it?